But not all visual communication tools are created equal. With YCharts, each output is a powerful visual that brings your analyses to life and intuitively explains the why behind your strategy. Go beyond a simple price chart and educate clients about the levers that truly impact performance or risk, and emphasize your most important insights with flexible chart annotations. Plus, custom branding, colors, and disclosures position you to fully own those insights. Go to YCharts.com to start your free trial. My name is Michael Guyette, publisher of the Lead Lag Report. Joining me for the rough hour is Carol Roth, who reached out to me, given that she's got a new book out, which hopefully will be a bestseller, and which I think everybody needs to pay attention to. You Will Own Nothing. So, Carol, for those who are not familiar with you, as we've done before, introduce yourself. Who are you, your background, and do you own a lot of things?
Michael, so great to be back with you. I think this might be our 5th or 6th collaboration. It's always a fantastic discussion. For people who are not familiar with me, I play a lot of roles, but the short version is that I am a recovering investment banker, an entrepreneur, and I play myself on television. I'm an author. My latest book, You Will Own Nothing, is out a week from today, but available for pre-order now. And I have my own action figure that is made in my likeness. So just some of the highlights there. But I do own some things, trying to own more for sure. And I am also not affiliated with the World Economic Forum.
Is there an action figure version of Klaus from World Economic Forum? That way, like, your action figure and his could just duke it out? I'd love to see that.
Well, we will have to look into that for certain.
So, jokingly, somebody said to me in a tweet in response to the space that, spoiler alert, the title tells you everything you need to know. So, first of all, lay out for the audience, one, your motivation. Why did you decide to put this book together? You Own Nothing. Some of the history behind, a lot of these things that you hear about the World Economic Forum. And if in writing it, you found that the concerns that are often parroted out there are valid or not.
So when I first heard of the You'll Own Nothing and You'll Be Happy saying, I think it was probably some sort of a meme that was going around Twitter. And, as things go around social media in general, you're always skeptical because often they are wrong or they were taken out of context. And knowing enough about the World Economic Forum, that it's a non-governmental organization that is littered with the business elite and the political elite, it seems strange that you'd have these people predicting the end of private property. So it took very little research on my part to find their video, the top 8 predictions for the world for 2030, which has input from their Global Futures Council. And the number one prediction right out there is you'll own nothing and you'll be happy, along with a bunch of other really uplifting predictions. Number 2 is the U.S. will no longer be the world's leading superpower, but nobody seems to focus on that one for whatever reason. Some others. And as I did more research, I found this concept of non-ownership was something that the WEF had sort of, talked about and repackaged in various ways. The video, was sort of affiliated with an article that had been written before then that was this, kind of fantasy daydream about non-ownership. They had other articles that was like, can you rent everything that you need in your life?
There was a comic book too, right? I think I remember seeing that floating around somewhere.
Yeah, I don't know about that, but it's not unusual that they would sort of repackage the ideas and try to sell them in different ways because it's something that I later found out that they do quite often. So, as somebody who's focused on wealth creation opportunities for people, as you are, Michael, one of the things that I've learned in over a quarter of a century is that wealth comes from ownership, right? You have to own assets that have the opportunity to retain their value and hopefully appreciate value. That's the way people generate wealth, as opposed to just having some income. So the fact that business and political elite were saying that you would, not own anything, and then the second part of it, you'd be happy about it, trying to get your buy-in, seems kind of strange to me and certainly concerning. So as I started going down the road of a number of other topics that I wanted to explore, whether it was social credit, whether it was ESG, whether it was central bank digital currencies, whether it was Wall Street competing with people to buy homes, wealthy people buying up land and water rights, millennials and Gen Z not being able to accumulate wealth. All of these things that I'm exploring, and I'm keep going like, what's the through line? What's the through line? And then one day I'm walking and it just sort of hit me like a lightning bolt in the head.
Okay, so there's a few things here. So I love I'm looking at the thread and somebody tweeted out, "You will eat sea bugs." Was the meme that somebody just put out listening to the space. Help me out. Isn't there an argument that we're kind of on that path independent of the World Economic Forum? I mean, at the logical extreme, the idea of you will own nothing and be happy can be quantified in terms of a wealth gap, right? I mean, if you have so much wealth being concentrated anyway, and that concentration increasing among select number of companies, select number of individuals, and everybody else largely, sucking off the government's, stimulus and things like that, we're kind of on that path anyway. So what makes that World Economic Forum dynamic different from the way things look like they're going anyway?
Yeah. So let me I guess I'll get into the nuance here. So the book itself is not about the World Economic Forum. The World Economic Forum plays a role, one of many bad actors. It was, their prediction was just an interesting through line to capture people's attentions. But I agree. I start the book off talking about World War F, basically a financial world war where we're all effed. And there are all these different, what I would consider bad actors and groups that are coming at us from different directions. So as you noted, the first being Fed, monetary policy and government, fiscal and other policy is definitely a huge piece of this sort of you will own nothing thesis. The second group that ties in, are the bad actors. And it's not just the WEF, it's the United Nations, it's lots of other big businesses. And then I think big tech is in a category of its own in terms of trying to take our lives and rent them back to us as a subscription or a service. So when we talk about you will own nothing, I'm not suggesting that this is a World Economic Forum specific thing. I think that the issue is that there are all of these forces coming at us from different places that ultimately have the same outcome, which is less ownership for us. And, part of the reason I feel like this is happening is because we are in a shifting financial landscape. I talk about something else that also sounds just as conspiratorial as the World Economic Forum, but also really isn't, which is New World Order. I kind of focus on a new financial world order. And sounds, very conspiratorial, but this is something that is being talked about in the open by everybody, including our president. If you go back to President Biden's speech to the Business Roundtable on March 21st, 2022, which you can find on the White House's website, he talks about how there is a shift in the financial world order every 3 or 4 generations. And it's true. We've, been at the pole position of the global financial universe for about 80 years. But before that, it was Britain. And before Britain, it was the Dutch. And then he says to them, there's going to be a new world order out there and we've got to lead it. Again, him talking to business leaders. So, the fact that things are changing globally, from a financial standpoint isn't really a big secret. And so when I think about it, when I think of groups like the WEF, which have these well-connected people, if you're wealthy and if you're powerful and financial stakes are going to shift, do you just hang back and hope that things work out for you? Or do you proactively try to go and control resources? So there's an important nuance between intention and being intentional and being deliberate. Nobody is intentionally, in my opinion, going, we have to get rid of freedoms, we have to take everybody's stuff. But I think the deliberateness is that they want more power and access and control for themselves, and getting rid of freedom and everybody else's stuff, particularly by getting you to buy into that concept. If that's what happens in the process, so be it.
Yeah, and part of that is the sort of well-known kind of bread and circuses kind of dynamic, right? If people want to stay in power, they distract the public. When Facebook Meta was all about the metaverse, I had put out that tweet saying, this seems awfully like a way for big companies to try to distract us from how poor the real world, you can argue, is, right? By pushing us to the virtual one, right? So I do think it's an interesting dynamic. But I think the other part of this also is that there's a degree of numbness in society, I'd argue, right? In the way that people are responding to things, even AI, right? It's like people have been noting that the AI interest has been dying down. It's only been 30 days, right? Since that. And it's like, it's amazing stuff you can do with ChatGPT. And it's like, whatever. I played for a friend of mine, this AI generative version of Thriller from Michael Jackson done in the style of somebody in the past. And they were like, oh, that's interesting. And like, it was just numbness. And I was like blown away by it, but they weren't. But I reference all that in the context of you own nothing. People almost don't care if they own anything because they're numb to stimulus anyway.
That is one of the big issues. And I think why it's so important to, talk about these issues and empower people with the knowledge, because particularly the younger generations, they've been trained for non-ownership. And I do think there is a degree of apathy because we have been, through this incredibly prosperous historic period of time, and we don't know anything else. Like, we only know the United States at the center of the financial universe. Things work out for us, generally good standards of life, even though, people are struggling more today than they have been in the past. But on a relative basis, still can maybe see some light at the end of the tunnel. And I just kind of try to put myself back in, when Britain was at the center of the universe. I would imagine that the British people felt that same level of invincibility. Like, okay, we're in charge of everything. Things are going great for us. I'm sure this is never going to change, but history has shown that does shift and change. And so, without financial literacy, just think about the stimulus that you were talking about. How many people said, I want my stimulus check. I got to get that $1,000 or $1,200, my Donnie dollars, my Biden bucks. I need that. I want my share, not realizing and not heeding the warnings of people, like myself, that are going, that's going to end up costing you $7,000+ a year for the rest of your life or more. You can't just take this money and create it out of nowhere without consequences. But people don't have that level of sophistication. And when they do see something wrong, they often blame it on the wrong factors. So I think, if you want to not own anything by choice, that's fine. But understanding the implications, I think, is one thing. And also having the hope that you can. I think a lot of the younger people, somehow buy into this because they're just worried that they won't have that opportunity. Like, they won't be able to buy a house. They won't be able to make these investments. So perhaps, that's partially a coping mechanism, and that's terrible. We should be preserving the American dream for everybody. Here in the United States, all of our heirs and the legacy that comes after us. And also, Michael, the world, because the reality is when the United States took over the pole position in the global financial universe, from Britain, it was great because we were this bastion of freedom and opportunity and, wealth creation and protection of individual rights. There isn't another entity like that waiting to step into that position. Anybody else who's a power and a challenger right now is a bastion of tyranny and ruled by dictators. So, it's sort of incumbent upon us, just as a place in the world, to preserve these ideas and the foundational principles that we have.
So the historical response to you will own nothing is off with their heads, right? I mean, let's face it. Every revolution is ultimately because of that. And I'd argue it goes back to widening wealth gap gets to the point where it's so extreme that people just rise up and they don't care if they die because they don't have anything to begin with and no hope.
Yeah.
This environment, though, it's so hard to imagine something like we've seen historically in a modern society where, forget about things like, the right to own guns and things like that. Just, again, I go back to people are just distracted and they seemingly don't care and they'd rather get their dopamine hits from TikTok than from actually having a bigger house, right? Because opportunities allow them to. How do we get to a place where people start to care again about what's happening to them?
I think that, there's always a tipping point, and it's what happened, at what point do you have, kind of scenario you talked about, nothing left to lose? So, you need to go and shift your behavior. Unfortunately, that's very much with human nature, is that the people who have nothing to lose are usually the most dangerous. We'd like to try to empower people with knowledge and get to a point to fix that ahead of time. And so I feel like that's the approach that I want to take, because if we do get into a scenario like that, it's going to be really ugly. One hypothesis that, I put forth in the book that could be one of those, kinds of catalysts where people really kind of wake up is, when you talk about the off with their heads and the eat the rich and the going after the billionaires, what's happened in modern society, particularly here in the US, is that anytime they dangle out the character or the carrot of the billionaires or the wealthy, it's really apt to come after the middle and working class. And we saw this recently with the hiring of, the IRS agents. The wish list was 87,000 new IRS staffers, large portion of that to be specifically agents. And, that's not to go after the, 800 or so billionaires in the United States. That's to go after small businesses and the working class and the middle class. You don't need, tens of thousands of agents to do that. So, I see a scenario, and one thing I hypothesize is that we have, and this was just an incredible data point from Sealy Associates, that noted that there is about $85 trillion, I think 84.4 was the exact number, almost $85 trillion that is set to turn over voluntarily through, legacy planning, people passing away, passing down that money and their wealth. And most of that is not billionaires. Most of that is average people's money, and that's over the next 23 years. And so if you look at, the debt of the government, you look at the almost $130 trillion in unfunded liabilities that they have, boy, wouldn't that be really nice for them to get their hands on? So what are we hearing? What are they doing? They're already talking about things like taxing unrealized capital gains and wealth taxes and inheritance taxes. And they're trying to get people to buy in, just like they're trying to get the you'll be happy and you'll own nothing. They're trying to get the buy-in by saying, oh, it's only going to be for the ultra wealthy. And once we lose these principles, once we lose the hard line that no, you can't go after somebody's wealth, particularly when it's, paper and unrealized, when you lose that, then it applies to everyone. And I don't think that people understand that the sophisticated estate planning of the elite who are on the inside, they're not the ones that are going to be affected. It's going to be the bulk of that, 84.4 trillion is going to be the average American's wealth. And I could see something like that happening. And I could see that being a tipping point where finally it's impacting enough people in their lives directly. But, again, the government creates these problems. They try to solve the problems, just like, we have with student debt. So, their ability to create issues and then come in and pretend to be the savior can't be underestimated.
The prediction is for 2030. So it's, as far as I guess when a lot of the stuff takes place from World Economic Forum's perspective. But this is if this is sort of the trend, it's kind of like that saying slowly, then all of a sudden, right? When people maybe start to wake up and realize it.
Yeah. And just to clarify, this was the WEF's projections or predictions for 2030 that we're playing off of. But in no way am I saying, or is anybody else, I think, saying that this is all going to happen by 2030. It might. But as you know, being in financial services, we can a lot of times see trajectories and outcomes, but we don't necessarily know a duration. I mean, how many short sellers have been completely right, but killed in the process because, the stock went way up before it eventually went back down.
NVIDIA.
So,
I'm sorry. I'm imagining NVIDIA as an example.
Yeah, exactly. So, this could be in 12 months, this could be in 12 years, it could be in 50 years. We don't know the duration, but we certainly can see the trajectory of all these different things happening. And I think what I'm trying to get people to do is understand this, empower them with knowledge, have them make behavioral decisions. We can't change the course of history fully, to say that we're never going to have a new financial world order. But does that mean that we can't delay it? Of course, we can probably delay it. We can also position ourselves well personally. And so, I think that understanding that trajectory versus, specific knowledge on, oh, this is a hard and fast date is an important differential.
I'm going to make the assumption that a good amount of that new world financial order is going to involve CBDCs. And I see that, one of the chapters is dedicated towards digital dollar. Lay that out a little bit for the audience. I mean, that's been floated out there for a while, but you think that's sort of where things are ultimately going to get the elites to see their plans go through?
I certainly think it's one of many possibilities. When I talk about the new financial world order and talk about the dollar sort of losing its place as the sole world reserve currency and sole trading currency, obviously we're seeing the BRICS plus nations coming hard, trying to kind of fight back against the fact that, not only has the US been dominated and they don't like that in general, but it's also been causing them huge issues, right? We haven't, at the Federal Reserve and government level, we haven't held the dollar stable for the good of the world economy, or by the way, for the United States. This is causing them all kinds of issues in terms of their ability to purchase food and energy and whatnot. So it's completely understandable that they want to try to find some alternate currencies, particularly after, the Biden administration weaponized the dollar, after Russia's invasion of Ukraine and froze access to reserves. I mean, who wants to hold dollar reserves when the US can just cut you off for it at any point in time? And these are legitimate concerns. So I think as, that comes about, and the fact that we have, so many countries around the world with massive debt loads, including our own country. I mean, we are, from a public debt to GDP standpoint, at around 125%, which is, has been said, not only by the IMF that, that's far beyond, what is an appropriate and reasonable level, but everybody from the Treasury Department to the CBO has, said it's an unsustainable fiscal path, that something has to give. And there are lots of different outcomes. Now, CBDC could play a role in all of this. And again, not conspiratorial. We know that the New York Fed did a pilot program with about a dozen major financial services institutions, and they actually published findings recently that were pretty favorable. Now, they were looking at a wholesale CBDC in that particular scenario based on the report. But the G7 nations all came out with their 13 principles for retail-facing CBDCs. And, so I do think the desire for them to try to figure out a problem to the debt loads and to kind of the place in the new financial world order could be through, the CBDC scheme. And it could be sold in a lot of different ways. We're dealing with lots of inflation. It becomes stubborn. Perhaps it goes up again if oil prices go up again. And so, they can say, hey, we have the ability to control inflation better if you come on board with a CBDC. You're not, of course, telling people that would mean that when they decide they want to destroy demand, they would just, not give you access to spend your money. But it's certainly a possibility. Another possibility is that they do some sort of conversion that the masses don't understand. We'll give you 100 digital dollars for every, US dollar that you give us. And just like we saw with the stimulus checks, the people who don't understand the consequences that you just can't, make up money from nowhere and not, debase the currency. I could see that as being a potential issue, or even maybe a UBI type of scheme where we'll give you a UBI, but, a universal basic income, but only if you sign on for a CBDC. So I think there are lots of different ways that could go. And obviously, that would have severe implications for all kinds of things, including our freedom and our agency, but also potentially for the value of the dollars that everybody's worked hard for. And, again, it all kind of comes back to the central theme of, you will own nothing, and destroying the value that's out there that you have, created if you leave everything in that dollar form factor and don't put it into, hard assets where you have that ownership and it has a better opportunity to retain its value.
Just to reset the room for the remaining minutes, everybody, please, if you don't already, make sure you follow Carol Roth, who's got a bit more hair than I do. on Twitter. And again, You Will Own Nothing will be available next week. I'm going to try and get this podcast out before next week so that those that happen to be listening to this conversation on Spotify can check that out. I'll try and link to it as well. If any of you want to come up and ask questions, click that bottom left mic request button and DM me. I see some people want to ask questions here. Just check your DMs, those that are in the queue, and I'm happy to bring you up. I think the one thing everybody wants to own, which is supposedly the American dream, is a house.
Yeah.
And I feel like we have to hit on how housing plays into this dynamic. And I'm going beyond the thing I keep tweeting about. Lumber says your house is fucked and all that stuff that I put out there. Right. But I do think it's an interesting dynamic what's happening in housing now and where things are ultimately going because, yes, why I myself believe housing is going to drop. The reality is it's still going to be largely unaffordable, even if it drops 15, 20%. So how does housing play into, what you put together in the book?
So housing is very interesting. Obviously, when you think about the American dream, the symbol that's always associated with that is a house. And I think for very good reason, because, across household, the house is the largest asset by dollar value, which, means that is where most American households are deriving their wealth from, which is pretty staggering. So you would think if we want people to gain more wealth and more wealth creation opportunities, you would make access to housing a little bit easier. So obviously that hasn't happened. And we have a couple things that, are to blame for that. One is obviously Fed and government policy. On the Fed side, after we had the Great Recession financial crisis and you had all the policies that, bailed out the banks and, I think it was somewhere around 4 to 5 million Americans lose their homes to foreclosures or short sales. You had, all of this supply in the market, which led to underbuilding and, kind of created supply demand imbalances. But, something else happened, which was, probably one of the most interesting pieces of the research that I did was when you had this Fed intervention in the market for so long and zero interest rate policy and them printing money, this easy money for corporations after they, kind of bid up, stocks, other assets, they went looking for yield and they couldn't figure out, enough places to put this money to work. And so for the first time ever in 2010, institutional money was introduced into the single family home market. Before 2010, there was no meaningful institutional capital. And you had these Wall Street firms that were going in and trying to compete with you to purchase a house with a huge advantage because not only had cheap capital and could make all cash offers, but they weren't planning to live in the house. They didn't have that emotional tie. And so, they're making up relationships with these agents and just buying up, anything and everything they could. And their intention wasn't to fix them up, make them nice, and then, flip them to you so that you can live in it and participate in that wealth creation opportunity. What they want to do is take away that wealth creation opportunity for you and rent you back the American dream. You'll own nothing and you'll be happy because, that's so great and convenient for you. And it's gotten to the point where about 1 in 5 homes now has been purchased by a corporate buyer, which is just crazy staggering. So between the supply demand imbalances and these extra people in the market, along with just, again, bad policies, government policy that add almost $100,000 to the price of constructing a new home, all kinds of, NIMBY and zoning policies that make it harder to build homes, labor market disruption that makes it hard to find the labor to build new homes. And obviously, you can weigh in on the lumber piece of this and whatnot. The pricing of houses went way up. So that's a big challenge for people in terms of buying houses. I think on the other side, if you are a young person and you're a first-time home buyer, you also have been killed from a personal balance sheet standpoint. And for many of those young people, that goes with their college debts. That we have this predatory lending scheme that has enabled a huge wealth transfer from young people to colleges and their administrators. And they're in many cases selling degrees that are, far too high for the product that they are offering and the financial return that it can derive. And so, these kids and young people don't have the financial wherewithal because they're still servicing debt in order to then think about making investments, including a house. So it really has become a 1-2 punch where they're getting killed. If you're sort of a young person or you're an average person in this country and you're not one of the existing massive asset holders, you haven't benefited from this 15 years of Fed intervention and near zero or zero interest rate policy and all the money printing. And all that has done is, transfer wealth from Main Street America to Wall Street. That's where I was going to go with this is that, and this is not sort of core to the thesis of my book, although I do talk about things like, ESG and Sri Lanka and, kind of draw some parallels there. One of the stories that I share in the book is from a vintage Twilight Zone episode. And the Twilight Zone episode goes something like this. There are aliens who come down to Earth and they say, hey, we're here. And the people of Earth are...
by the way, the moment you said aliens, I knew exactly the episode you were talking about. I'm not going to spoil, but I know exactly what the...
Yeah, you know where I'm going with this. Okay, so the aliens come to Earth and obviously the people of Earth are saying, what are you doing here? And they're like, well, you have all these famines and you fight amongst yourselves and wars. And we have this technology that can solve all of this. And we've seen that. And we want to come to Earth. We want to help you out. And, the people of Earth are kind of skeptical. So they put one of the aliens through a lie detector test. And as they're doing this, they notice that he leaves like one of his books, like his notebooks, his guidebook behind. And the CIA type of group grabs it and they work on trying to decode it. And they get the title and it's To Serve Man. And as the alien passes the lie detector test, they say, well, it looks like this book is a noble intention, just like, everything foots. They're here to help us out. They're here to serve man. So, that's great. So that they start using the technology and everything is going fine. And the people of America start boarding spaceships to go visit the aliens' home planet. And then the person who's working on decoding this book starts to crack the code even further. And as her boss is boarding the spaceship to get onto the alien planet, she screams after him, To Serve Man is a cookbook. And that's sort of one of the things that is the takeaway from a lot of the research that I've done. And going back to the initial thesis of, the elite trying to jockey to control resources for themselves, it's really nice to think there are a bunch of Mother Teresas out there that are doing everything to help the world and make it a better place. But, people are very self-serving, and not to say that there aren't a handful of them, but I just always have To Serve Man as a cookbook in the back of my head. And even though the stated intention sounds great, I think we also need to consider, what else could be going on along with that process. And how does that good intention end up with a really bad outcome? Michael, is that where you were going?
I literally shared it in the nest. I tweeted it very quickly before you said To Serve Man, and I found the Wikipedia page. If you look at the top Twitter space, that was always one of those great episodes. It's like that was the big reveal. It was a cookbook, right? And people were just going into the UFO, right? And it was just a phenomenal scene. You're saying that. I see a couple more people want to ask questions. Just make sure you follow me, and I'll DM you. But let's go to.
First of all, it's great to connect with you. I obviously see you on Twitter all the time, so it's great to actually hear your voice. I am not as much of a crypto person as perhaps some of the other people on this particular space. But I think first of all, one of the reasons why cryptocurrency, particularly something like Bitcoin, hasn't taken the role, in the financial system is because the people in the financial system don't want it to take the role, right? How do you maintain power? You maintain power with control over the money supply and money itself, if you can. And obviously, central banks and governments don't want to have the decentralization that we would all like. And that's, part of the thesis here. In fact, they want to do the opposite. They want to confuse and conflate cryptocurrency with central bank digital currencies to get people to buy into a very centralized Fed and government controlled currency, I believe. But I do think that your point is valid, and it kind of touches on a lot of the aspects that we're talking about here with the central planning and these ideas, is that I don't think a lot of them are particularly well thought through, or they just don't care. Because if you actually went through what was required in order to do the things that they're talking about, the reality gets in the way. But we see this time and time again, whether it's, ESG, moving us away from fossil fuels and all of the issues that creates, to something like, MMT, modern monetary theory, which I refer to as magic money tree. The reality of the situation never sort of stops them from, doing the things that they think will get them more power and control, even if it's only short-term oriented. And so I think that's, one of the issues that we need to be aware of. And again, why we need to empower people with more information and knowledge, because if you have a better understanding and we can kind of debunk and push back on these things, you may see some shifts. I mean, we've seen Larry Fink at BlackRock, we called him out with ESG as a scam and a bad thing. And now he's saying, oh, it's too politicized. I'm not going to use that word anymore. Well, it's not the word, it's the underlying issue. But it is showing, at least in certain areas, that our awareness and, the knowledge, and then transforming that into some action can undo some of these, crazy central planning dictates and mandates.
Yeah, and make sure you follow Carol. Keep her book coming out next week on your radar. Pre-order it. It will be even better.
Yeah, I was going to say, Michael, that it's available for pre-order now, and that will get it in your hands faster. And it's always a good time to practice the behavioral switch to owning things. So consider owning a hard copy, because we don't know when they're going to go back in and change the words in digital versions and audio version and whatnot. If you own that hard copy, you'll know what I actually wrote.
To hell with libraries. Own it. Don't. Okay, but hold on. And by the way, just to be clear for everybody here, I've never actually met Carol in person. I hope to do so one day, but I'm doing this space because I respect Carol. She's very knowledgeable, as you can tell. I'm not getting paid to promote her book, right? This is just me being honest as somebody who is an observer of somebody who's in the arena like Carol and trying to put out great content like she does. So before we wrap up, and again, word I'll try to get to you, but we'll see how this shapes up. Give us a little bit of a tease, Carol, on, okay, what do you do about it? Okay, so owning assets is, nice to say as a solution. So we try to do that to some extent anyway. So under your framework, what are some of the things that people can do to protect themselves that you've outlined in the book?
Yeah, so I take sort of each of the different issues that we're confronting that I outline in the book, and I try to address the behavioral, and in some cases financial behavioral changes that you can make. Some of the people on this call may be more sophisticated, some may be less sophisticated, but there is a piece regarding that part we talked about in terms of wealth transfers and the inheritances that are happening. And I have a great estate attorney, Andrew Egan, who lends some credibility, some advice in the book, who talks about whether or not you're super sophisticated or not, using things like estate planning and trusts to create some more potential barriers around what wealth you do have. Maybe consider gifting up to the maximum money to your heirs now and not just leaving it out there, and doing things that we can't guarantee you're going to be grandfathered in if there is a future change, but knowing that the people who usually are grandfathered in are the wealthy and well-connected, and using certain mechanisms that they're going to use in terms of estate planning, that's something that may make sense there. For something like the CBDCs we're talking about, to the extent that's a concern for you, what happens if the government were to shut off access to your money, whether it would be to control inflation, or maybe you said something on social media that they didn't like, or you ate too many burgers that month and they're trying to, be better for the environment. Like, whatever the reason, how do you survive a shift like that? Are you going to use something, whether it be crypto, which again isn't really in my purview, but things like precious metals, getting them in smaller denominations, or other things that you can do to barter, people in your community that you can make sure that you have access to food and medical care and important things if we do enter a period of chaos. And, I can sort of read your mind, Michael. You're probably going, Carol, you sound like a prepper here. And what I would say is that there's a clear nuance in my mind between being a prepper and being prepared. I think a prepper is somebody who lives a lifestyle and they live with this fear on them all the time. And they kind of embrace that as part of their lifestyle. Being prepared is just making a plan so that this doesn't weigh on you. And that if things do go sideways or become chaotic, that you have thought through it and you aren't, panicking in the situation. I liken it to if your house is burning down, it's a really bad time not only to try to buy insurance, but also to come up with an escape plan, right? You're going to be panicked in that situation. You want to have thought through that already and just be able to walk through and deal with that emergency. So that's the same kind of things that I'm talking about here in the final chapter is what behavioral changes and shifts can you make that if things do shift and change, that you're not all of a sudden processing it at that moment. And, just in general, I think that diversification and having different strategies is sort of a good thing just as a base financial practice. But in the face of these huge potential global financial shifts, I think it's even more important.
We'll do one more very quick question.
So, Stephen, first of all, great to connect with you and thanks for the kind words. This was very different. My publisher contacted me, said, we want another book. They threw some things out there that I said, no, that's terrible. I would never do that. But, I have all these things in my head that I'm concerned about. Like I'm concerned about CBDC. I'm concerned about ESG. I'm concerned about social credit, both, formally and non-formally. I'm concerned about what's happening to young people. I'm concerned about the American dream. I'm concerned about Harvard and Bill Gates buying up land and water rights, all of these things that I'm concerned about. And I just spent a while trying to figure out what's the through line. And, as I said in the beginning, it just I was just literally walking 3 steps one day and it hit me that the you will own nothing was the through line. So it wasn't a particular one thing that was sort of a role. It was that I was kind of looking at all of these things going on and all of these concerns that people were talking to me about. And I was trying to connect those dots and it just sort of, came to me as that connection and I was able to move forward from there.
Everybody, again, please make sure you follow Carol Roth. I will have this as a podcast under Lead Lag Live on Spotify, Apple, and all of your favorite platforms. And hopefully I will see you all again. So anyway, thank you for joining. Thank you, Carol. And hopefully I'll see you all later.
Thanks, Michael, for hosting us. And thanks everybody for listening. Appreciate it and hope you will pre-order